On today's Locked On Jayhawks, Kansas with a bad outing, to say the least, against Texas. A lot of people say it doesn't matter. It didn't to Big 12 standings for KU, but we'll discuss maybe a few worries out of the game, even though at the end of the day, it's really not that worrisome. This is Locked On Jayhawks.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Falls 75-59 in Austin against the Texas Longhorns, a game that didn't matter for KU. They'd won the Big 12 outright. They'd clinched it coming in. It mattered a lot for Texas. They were trying to get out of a rut. They were trying to get some momentum back at the end of the season. It was senior day for them. They're playing the Jayhawks, which is always a kind of circle event for different teams when they're playing them at home. So for all those reasons, just motivation aside, the game doesn't really end up mattering. And it doesn't change the fact that this Kansas team still won the most incredibly hard version of the Big 12 that we've ever seen, and that they're still in the race for the number one overall seed, that they're going to get a 1 seed in general, and that they're still the 1 seed for the Big 12 tournament. None of that changed. Now, there are a few things that we can point to, and I know some people will say, well, yeah, but the game didn't matter at all. Didn't matter at all. Here's where that argument kind of dies for me. It would have been one thing if Kansas went into the game saying, because of this game not meaning anything to the standings, like we might play him a few less minutes, or we're going to give this guy a break. Kevin McCullough or Dwan Harris, like they just had rolled ankles recently. Like we're going to let them play 10 less minutes, or they're just not going to play today. Or Jalen Wilson's been carrying a big load for this team all season long. Like we're going to give him a day off. It would have been one thing if that was the result last night, and that is what happened. It would have been another thing too if you went in there last night or on Saturday and you lost by 6 or 7 points. It's like, okay, well, you played a good game, but sometimes the other team is just better, and you played them on the road against a good, very talented Texas team. Like, okay, shrug your shoulder. Sometimes that happens. Where you lose me with it is Kansas went into this full-fledged saying, we're taking this seriously. You heard Dwan Harris say, I've never won in Austin before, and I want to get that out of the way. And, you heard from Dwan talking about how important this game still was and how they still wanted to win the game. You heard from Bill Self talking about that, no, they're not going to rest anyone and that they're still taking it seriously and it's competitive. And there's nothing wrong with all those things that were said. I'm not trying to say that's the case. Those, you want your team to be competitive and all those things. Those are not bad. My point there is this, though. That means they took this game seriously. So if you lose by 16 and you look bad in a lot of ways, I don't know that you can just chalk it up to say, oh, well, it didn't matter. They didn't care. There was no motivation. When literally every message that we heard from players and coaching staff coming into the game was that they are going to take it serious. Now, maybe that's just putting on a bit of a front because you're not going to come out to the press conference and go, oh, yeah, we don't care. If we lose, whatever, right? That's not what's going to happen at the press conference. So maybe there is a little bit of that. But when that was the message all week long, if you lose by 16 and look as poor as Kansas did in that game, all of a sudden it doesn't just become, well, who cares? Throw it away. Again, I'm not saying panic mode or that this is like the end of the world, but I do think there's some things you can take away from the game, and it's not as simple to just say, well, the game didn't matter. Remove everything from your equation. So Kansas just kind of stunk in the game. They shot, 14 of 36 on 2-point shots, which is 39%. That's one of their lower marks of the season after they shot 55%, I think, in the first game with Texas. They were really able to drive them, get open lanes to the rim, and take advantage of Texas' kind of lack of size. Not a great 3-point shooting game. They shot 31% from 3 in February. They shot 32% from 3 in this game. So you were hoping that maybe dug out of the rut, but still did not there. You shot poorly at the free throw line. You didn't have a ton of turnovers, but you didn't turn them over. They had 15 in the first game. You only got them to 7 turnovers in this game. You did a good job on the defensive glass, but you didn't get a ton on the offensive glass either, which has kind of been the case a majority of the season for KU here. But against Texas in the first meeting, you had like 14 offensive rebounds, and they've not been a good defensive rebounding team. You weren't able to take advantage of that. And it felt super sluggish all the way through. Overall, Kansas shoots 36% from the game. It was similar to the Iowa State game in Ames, which, again, going back to the idea that you shouldn't over worry, like Kansas shook off that Iowa State loss earlier this season. And they after looking horrible in Ames, losing by 15, looking so lethargic, they beat Texas by 8. They beat Oklahoma by 23. That was the start of 7 straight wins for them. So again, if they go out in the Big 12 tournament now and they win out, again, nobody is going to be pointing back to this. But you can look at it the other way too, because now I think there's just more pressure with the Big 12 tournament. But it was similar to that game in Ames, because not just because you lost by 15, in this case 16, and doing it on the road, but it was back to the what we were used to with like Jalen Wilson having that stretch where he was just going off, like 23 points for Jalen, 10 rebounds, and then nobody else gets in double figures for KU. Like DeJuan Harris had his worst shooting game of the season. He still had 7 assists to 0 turnovers, and I thought did a pretty good job on Marcus Carr. I mean, Carr had 6 points, but offensively, it was a struggle for him. Kevin had kind of a, not a good game, not a bad game. KJ had some positives, negatives. Grady Dick, I don't know what's going on there. That's probably the biggest negative to come out of the game. This is now back-to-back games where he's been kind of invisible from the offense, and he is such an integral part of the offense. You need to get him going again. Maybe hitting those last 2 threes will be enough to kind of get him going in the Big 12 tournament, but that is pivotal for Kansas moving forward. And then nothing again from the bench. But again, overall, I think you're fine. You lost on the road against a really good team in a game that did not affect your Big 12 standings. But basically, my biggest worry would be your bit of recent play here. So you look back to the West Virginia and Texas Tech game. Both games that you were supposed to win, if you just look at like spread, for instance, or what Ken Palm's projecting, somewhere between like 8, 9, 10 points in each game. You barely won both and very easily could have lost both. Then you lose by 16 at Texas. That does not necessarily give confidence that you're ending the season here on a high note, right? It does not feel like you're peaking at this very moment based on those last 3 games. And so this was a continuation of that. And so I think what it just does is it does put more pressure on the Big 12 tournament. Like I said, if you go out and win the Big 12 tournament, this loss is washed away. But if you lose, let's say in the Big 12 quarterfinals, right? If you would have won that game and then lost in the Big 12 quarterfinals, we would have just easily moved past the Big 12 quarterfinal loss and said, the Big 12's hard. Sometimes you lose weird games. If you lose in the Big 12 semifinals, but you eke by the Big 12 quarterfinals, then you lose in the Big 12 semifinals, we're going to be like, okay, this doesn't feel like you're peaking at the right time headed into the NCAA tournament. So I think what it just did by you losing, because again, if you would have lost by 5, 6, 7 points at Texas, and then you lost in the Big 12 semis or maybe the Big 12 finals, I don't know that we would be having this conversation. But because how much you got blown out by, I just think that's what it is. There's just more pressure on the Big 12 tournament, maybe even less about winning it and just looking good again, right? Like having a game or two in the Big 12 tournament where you just look really good. You look like that 1 seed. You look like a team who should be maybe the number 1 overall seed. Do that. But at the end of the day, everything's still in front of you. You can win the Big 12 tournament. You can still get the number 1 overall seed. You're going to be a 1 seed nonetheless. You won the Big 12 outright. So everything is just fine for this team, and they still have opportunities to prove that everything's just fine. But there is that little bit of a worry because now there is more pressure on the Big 12 tournament, and because those last 3 games, they haven't really looked fully loaded to what we're expecting this team should be for the games that were previous to the last 3. We're going to get on to our GOATs of the game here in just a second. But first, this episode of Jayhawks is brought to you by Built Bar. Looking for a delicious treat, but don't want all of the fat and calories, then you got to try a Built Bar. If you're like me, where you want to eat healthier, but don't want to compromise taste, then Built Bar is perfect because healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious that you won't think they're good for you. And what makes Built Bar so good, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. They come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. And what's even better is they're healthy. Only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. we have always talked about, you can get them at built.com, which you still can. You can order online at built.com. But now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club too while you're doing your grocery shopping, or if you just want to go pick some up in person, give them a try. Head to your nearest Walmart today. Walk to the pharmacy section, grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of flavors like cookies and cream, double chocolate, coconut puffs. You can go to your nearest Sam's Club and get a 13-bar box with hit flavors like brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later with Built Bar. On to the GOATs of the game. We'll start with the good GOATs. Number one would be Jalen Wilson. 23 points, 10 rebounds. Did take him a good amount of shots to get there. He was just 4 of 11 from 2. Everybody for Kansas struggled from 2. And he did shoot well from 3. 3 of 7 from 3. The rest of Kansas was 4 of 15 from 3-point range. But overall, not bad efficiency. 23 points when nobody else was scoring. Double figures for Kansas, and he also had 10 rebounds. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, it was shades of when you had that bad stretch, when Jalen was getting 20, 25, 30, 40 points in a game, and nobody else was stepping up. That's what happened in that game against Texas. And I will say, Texas defended their ass off, man. Tip of the cap to them. Like, Texas played really, really good defense. There were not many open shots that Kansas had. Like, the Texas Tech game, Kansas missed a lot of open shots. Texas game, there weren't a lot of open shots to be had. And Texas is a very physical, athletic team that when they're defending at that level, they're very, very difficult to beat. But it is interesting now. Texas is actually ahead of Kansas in KenPom. And there have been a lot of years that because of Bill Self and his magic and because of the scheduling that you've done, Kansas has been overseeded to maybe what they are in like a metric site like KenPom. And it's hurt them in the NCAA tournament where, maybe a team that plays more like a 3 seed as a 2 seed or plays like a 2 seed as a 1 seed, and they get upended early in the tournament. And I just hope that's not the case for this year's team, but they have plenty of time in the Big 12 tournament to kind of make up ground in that regard. But yeah, Jalen was good for you. Really bounced back too, because he missed his first couple shots. I think he started like 0 for 3, 0 for 4 after having the 2-point game against Texas in Lawrence. And yeah, he certainly showed that he figured it out. I don't know. It's impossible to predict what's going to happen in the Big 12 tournament because it's so loaded. But I almost get the sense Kansas wants to play Texas in a Big 12 championship. Well, they want to get revenge a little bit there. And I think you would expect a much better performance if that were to be the case. But Kansas has a tough road to get there first, and so does Texas to try to get to that point too. Good GOATs, Grady Dick's last 2 shots. He was pretty non-existent for a majority of the game. He finished 2 of 5 from the floor. All of those were from 3-point range. He had 6 points for the game, just 2 rebounds, no assists. He struggled on defense. They were targeting him a good amount. But, it wasn't, I think the disappointing part wasn't just the fact that, he wasn't scoring a lot. It was that he wasn't taking shots. He wasn't being aggressive. He wasn't moving a ton off the ball. Kansas wasn't able to find him a ton. Like, I don't know how much of it was him not moving enough or just the team not doing a good enough job getting him open. But either way, that's becoming a problem here. You have 10 points from Grady Dick the last 2 games. And you need him to be more aggressive. You need him to be taken because he's your best option from the outside. Kansas shooting 32% from 3 since February. There's your issue right there. Like, you got to get that up to 34, 35% over the course of the NCAA tournament, if not better. And so your best 3-point option needs to be that guy. You need him not trigger shy. And so you got him those last 2 threes. That could be the one little positive message out of that game, that even though the second half didn't go well, like maybe you found a way to get Grady Dick going. He hit back-to-back threes to kind of close out the game. So that could be a positive out of the game. That's a GOAT. Not a lot of good GOATs to choose from. So we're kind of choosing from small things here. The other one is rebounding. KU actually did a pretty good job on the glass. Now, Texas hasn't been a great rebounding team this year, so you would expect it, but you did a good job. You only had 7 offensive rebounds, which is not like a great number, but you held them to just 4. This is really about defensive rebounding for KU, just holding them to those 4 rebounds. And that was actually, by defensive rebounding rate, KU's best game of the season. Texas only collected about 13% of their own misses. The only games that they've done better, or I'm sorry, it was the best game of the season. The only games that are close to that, I should say, which are like second and third, are the Kentucky and Wisconsin games, which the Kentucky one is still wild with Oscar Tshiebwe. So good rebounding game for KU. Obviously, if you look up at the total at the end of the day and you're like, oh, well, Texas had 2 more rebounds total than Kansas. What do you mean? Okay, but Kansas missed a lot more shots than Texas did. If you go by percentage, it was a very good rebounding game for KU. We're going to get on to our bad goats of the game here in just a second with Locked On Jayhawks. So our bad goats, we had Jalen Wilson and the good goats. We had the 2 last shots from Grady from 3 and then the rebounding. Bad goats is everyone else. Everyone else gets on bad goats here. Not a great game for everyone else for KU. Now, there were certain things you can take away that other people did where it's like, okay, well, that was good, right? Kevin McCullough had, I think, 8 rebounds. That was good. Or maybe it was 6. DeJuan Harris, 7 assists to 0 turnovers. He also had 5 rebounds. That was good. But he had just 5 points on 2 of 12 from the floor. Just felt like he was almost forcing it inside. And that's the thing. It's that fine balancing act with you want DeJuan Harris a lot more aggressive. You want him scoring the basketball. So I don't think you tell him to, I don't know, like you don't want to tell him to dial it down too much to where it's back to a point where he's just not trying to score. But also, like, you don't want him overly aggressive, crossing over that line where he's just taking kind of wild shots. Now, to be fair, again, Texas was defending very well. And a lot of times it ended up in the hand of DeJuan. And it was like, hey, we got to take a shot, just drive and do something, right? So DeJuan struggles. Grady Dick struggles. He had just the 6 points, didn't fill up the stat sheet in other ways. Kevin McCullough had 8 points on 8 shots with 4 turnovers. I thought about putting Kevin in limbo, to be honest, but with the 4 turnovers, it's a little bit tougher, which was over a third of the team's output there. KJ had 9 points, which is your closest to double figures besides Jalen, but he just had 2 rebounds. That was after kind of back-to-back games where he had some of his better total rebounding games where he was getting 7 or 8 in a game. So he was just down to 2 rebounds. He didn't really have a big impact on the game. And there were a lot of plays. Typically, like, KJ Adams is the guy that wins all the hustle balls. There were several hustle balls that Texas just won over him. I don't expect that to continue or anything, but if that's one of your skills and one of the things that you're relied on to do, and it doesn't happen that game, that's unfortunate for your side of the bench. So, that wasn't great. And then the bench, man, I don't know if this was maybe the biggest negative from the game, like in terms of a group or anything. But the bench has fallen off. So we had basically in December, there were a couple nice flashes from the bench. You had the game against Indiana where Zuby and Bobby were really good. You had a couple flashes over the course of that month. Then you get to January and the bench was non-existent. And then we get to, I guess, the end of January with the Kentucky game to the beginning of February through middle February, where the bench wasn't going off every game. Like, there would be a game. It would be like maybe a game or two where you would get 1 or 2 good bench performances, right? Like the Texas game, Joe Yesufu was really good. Ernest Uday was really good. And you go down the line, like whether it would be the entire bench playing well or just 1 or 2 guys playing well off the bench, it felt like 2 out of every 3 games, the bench was giving you something. But then there'd be 1 game in there where it wasn't. But it did feel like it was turning a corner and that you were getting more from the bench than you were in previous weeks. But then all of a sudden, a couple weeks ago, so the West Virginia game happens, nothing from the bench. And it's like, okay, well, maybe they'll just get it next game. Texas Tech game, nothing from the bench. And then this game against Texas, nothing from the bench, which is now a trend. It is now a streak, 3 straight games, to where you feel like all that progress that you made in February, it feels like it hasn't gotten you anywhere in better footing at this point in time, because it just feels like you've kind of reverted to the norm here. Over the last 3 games, the bench has been pretty non-existent. And in this game specifically, if you want to total it up, 33 minutes total from the bench from Bobby Pettiford, Joe Yesufu, MJ Rice, Michael Jankovic, Zach Clements, Ernest Uday, Zuby Ejiofor, which I did think it was interesting. I do think Bill Self was saying, I did think you saw a little bit of that. The fact that, hey, we're down by so much. We already won the Big 12 outright. Let's give a shot to Zach Clements and Zuby Ejiofor to see if they can earn more playing time or at least get a little bit of playing time in a high-pressure environment that could help them later down the road. I did think that was a benefit of this game, but overall, 33 minutes from the bench from those guys, 8 points on 3 of 8 from the floor, 2 rebounds, 0 assists, 3 turnovers. And you go back, like I said, over the last 3 games, it's like 71 minutes from the bench. They've scored, I think, 16 points of that span, 1 assist to 6 turnovers. It has not been good from the bench. And, I think this is probably the worst bench that Bill Self has ever had at Kansas, right? Which is crazy when you think about it, because every big man coming off the bench for Kansas right now, because Cam Martin's injured. So you have Zach Clements, Ernest Udeh, Zuby Ejiofor off the bench. All 3 of those guys are either McDonald's All-Americans or darn near it, to where they were like 4-star recruits that were not far off from being in that designation. And then you look at, Bobby Pettiford, top 100 recruit, who's in year 2. Joe Yesufu, who 2 years ago went off in March and has been trying to figure that out. MJ Rice, who's a 5-star recruit, McDonald's All-American. You look at everybody coming off the bench, you would think at least one of these guys on the bench would be pretty good for KU, or that at least it would be back to what it was at the beginning of February, where it was, inconsistent, but you would have some good games here or there. And you could say, well, what about those 2016, 2017, 2018 teams for Kansas that had such a thin bench where they were, playing 6-7-man rotations and they only had maybe 11 or 12 scholarship guys. Okay, that's a fair argument. Those teams weren't as deep, but you know what those teams had? They had at least one guy who would come off the bench. Like, think about it. In the 2017 season, as thin as that team was, Sviatoslav Mikhailuk was coming off the bench, right? I'm trying to think if it wasn't, it was like LeGerald Vick coming off the bench. You still at least had something to bring off the bench there. And this team, you're just getting nothing from the bench. It's a real problem. And at this point, we're in March. I don't know how much that's going to change for the NCAA tournament. But again, once you do get to the tournament, shorter rotations are more than fine. You just still need at least a 6th and 7th guy to give you something. And right now, that's not really the case. Last one for the bad goats here is people saying to chill after the loss. Like I said, this isn't the end of the world. Kansas is going to be just fine. There's 2 lines here. I'm kind of playing in between. If you think that was doomsday for Kansas after the game, or you think they're screwed, or you think that shows that they can't win the tournament, I would just say this, let's not forget last year. Last year, in the final week of the regular season, you lost to TCU in Fort Worth by double-digit points. And that was a game after you lost in Waco to Baylor by double-digit points. Now, sure, it wasn't the regular season finale, but it was the last week of the season. You ended up just fine, right? This team can be just fine. Like I said, puts more pressure on the Big 12 tournament, but you're going to be just fine, and you've put yourself in great shape. And other teams around the country would kill to be in the position you're in. If you asked, every other team in the country, pretty much, except for, Alabama and Houston, hey, would you take a 16-point loss in the finale to Texas, but you win the Big 12 outright, you're going to be a 1 seed? They'd be like, yes, of course I would take that. Now I get it. Kansas sets the bar higher and the expectations are higher. But also at the same point in time, the people who yesterday were just all over social media being like, everybody needs to chill out. This game doesn't matter at all. Dude, you can still take away some stuff from it. Because like I said, you approached this game with all the competitive natures that you were trying to win it. And so you were trying and you lost by 16. That doesn't bode well. And just to act like there's nothing to take away from the game, just to act like, it doesn't matter at all, that there's nothing to worry about when the last 3 games have been a little concerning, you lose me there. And also the fact that, why are you the police on how, if certain fans want to be in their emotions after the game, let people react. Who are you to just tell everybody? I don't know, whatever. Doesn't matter. I'm playing the middle. I think they're probably going to be fine. But I also understand why there would be some worry out of the game. And I think it's okay to kind of be in the middle there. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Jayhawks. Probably not as fun of a one because, you lose by 16. We're going to be joined by Nick Schwerdt on Tuesday's episode to kind of discuss if there is a concern level over these last 3 games. What's this team's identity? Another edition of Whose Statline Is It Anyway? Then we'll get into some Big 12 tournament talk, maybe some Big 12 award talk later in the week, and get into our preview of the KU game in their quarterfinal when we get to it. This has been Locked On Jayhawks. We'll be back on Tuesday. Like I said, you can hit me up at D Johnson Radio on Twitter. Subscribe to us wherever you get any of your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube or wherever, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud. Give us a good review if you could. See you